payments space, in my opinion, is the most intriguing and potentially impactful area of the entire fintech revolution. I think it's fair to say that the innovation that's occurring in this space right now is going to change the world forever. As such, I wanted to do an interview to talk about the UK's position as a leading player in the global payment space. I spoke to the Chief Risk Officer for real-time payments and applications at Mastercard, Tim Neill. And what a pleasant guy. We talked about his love of endurance racing along with the global macro picture and his forecast for the payment space over the next couple of years. Mastercard are a fascinating, world-renowned organization, and Tim is a down-to-earth guy who I could have spoken to for hours. If you like payments, if you like fintech, or even if you don't, you will inevitably love this one. It is Tim Neill. So Tim, thank you so much for doing this. We are down in your offices in Cannon Street in London. Thank you for the Mastercard cycling jerseys. They are very well received.
Welcome.
And thank you for your time as well. It's a lovely day here in London. We've been really excited about this interview. First of all, I just wanted to ask you, there's lots going on in the world right now. There's a war in Ukraine, there's turbulence in the financial markets. What's on trend at Mastercard right now? What kind of thing are you talking about in your board meetings?
The space that I work in is largely looking at real-time payments, is the world that my team and I play in, which is different from the card rails place. So if you think about the difference between the two is, of course, Mastercard, obviously, most people would know it because of the credit card system. But what we also do is real-time payments, or some people will call it account-to-account payments, ACH, auto-clearing payments. So that is what we know here in Britain as faster payment service and the BACS payment service and those sort of things. So the ability to move money between two accounts.
Absolutely. So for the listeners who are not familiar with yourself, they'll obviously be familiar with Mastercard, but maybe not yourself. Can you tell us maybe a little bit give us a summary of your career?
Yep, sure. So as my accent probably gives away, not from England at all or Britain, but from Australia. But I've been here for about 20 odd years now. So my background actually, I, by accident, not by design, sort of fell into the sort of finance industry really. I did police studies, so sort of criminology background, criminal justice studies, and came over to the UK 20 odd years ago to sort of fill a gap between leaving university and getting a real job, and ended up being offered a consultancy role at Goldman Sachs. And that sort of kicked off my career, and I sort of, fell in love with, the high speed intensity of high volume trading environments and the banking system, and London itself, of course, being, this incredibly fast moving place that's, was fascinating to work in. And that sort of started the process. And so I went into a security role at Goldman's. And then from there, spent a couple of years there consulting, and then moved over to Barclays and spent a couple of years consulting there again in a security risk capacity. And then sort of moved through a couple of other businesses in a similar sort of functional role, looking at either resilience or risk or security in all those fields. And it really was sort of following a technical advancement of all those different banking operations that were running around the world. When I first got into banking, I can remember what was then the FSA, now known as the FCA. The FSA was starting to put out requirements for the big banks to have resilience and failover and disaster recovery, and data centres, set a certain distance away from the core bank and so on. And because I was working in the sort of physical security and resilience side, that was sort of within our wheelhouse to be responsible to help the banks design and build those recovery suites around the location. And so by necessity, I started to become quite technically aware. And so I had to understand how the trading systems work in enough detail to be able to understand how to, move applications in real time over to recovery sites, and then looking at things like data storage provisions. And so over the last couple of decades, I've just sort of really cut my teeth in that field. And so led me into the risk role that I work in now.
So when a child asks you, I'm sure you've got a young relative, and they ask you, Tim, Uncle Tim, what do you do for a living? What's your response?
So, I've got a 10-year-old who thinks that what I do isn't very cool. He suggested the other day that I might want to change jobs to do something more fun, like be a cowboy or
or pirate.
Or a fireman pirate. But I was explaining it to him recently, and I said that I'm the chief risk officer for the real-time payments business at Mastercard. And at that, he sort of screwed his face up, and that's what he said, "That's not very cool, Dad." What does that mean? But our purpose is to help the business identify risks that they already have in place and quantify those. So how big, how wide, what will it take to fix them or remove them, or how to manage them if they're to be risk accepted, because some risks simply can't be removed because of the nature of the business. And also to enable them to be able to quantify that risk in terms of a materiality level. So what does it mean in terms of the service outage provisions or against the regulations that are in place? And then also to identify risks that are emerging. So risks that we see that are coming. And that can include anything from the geopolitical noise coming out of the Russia-Ukraine events, right? Which is a number of people will tell you is, one of the principal drivers for the inflation that we're seeing at the moment that's running because of supply and whatever for various items that are harder to get. Also being able to articulate things like the effect of COVID, the effect that that's had on the markets around the world, and certainly affected things like our ability to be able to get certain key equipment and hardware for our technology requirements. So we spend a lot of time looking at those sort of risks, and we do that through a whole range of ways, whether it be researching through peer organisations or various forums that run, or specific investigative work that we're doing with our partners or suppliers and what have you. And then ultimately what we have to do then is convert all of that risk summary that I just talked about into a quarterly report. And that risk report goes to the risk committee. And the risk committee then effectively interrogates that report and determines whether the materiality that's being declared by the business owners is in fact correct.
Sure.
And that then goes to the board for review. And so there's a corporate governance process effectively seeks to try to identify and keep the business honest, but also help the business get to a point of effective management more quickly and transparently.
You've worked within banking for a number of years, but when did you first dip your toe into payments as a specialism? Was it Vocalink?
Was Vocalink, yeah. So Vocalink was about 4 years ago I joined, which at the time had recently been acquired by Mastercard.
Right, yeah.
So Vocalink is the UK payments service that was founded, I think, 48 years ago now.
Yeah.
And it was the origins of Vocalink was effectively, it was a formation or, if you will, almost a co-op of all the UK banks wanting to create a system where they could move money intraday between the banks.
Sure. Well, that's how Visa come about, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think.
And Mastercard.
Collaboration.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question is, the payment system you got in 8 years ago to the payment space, what's changed in the last 8 years? What's the most significant change you've seen in the industry in the last 8 years?
For us, there's the speed at which the rest of the world is catching up. So one thing to say that...
Because the UK is a market leader in many respects, isn't
it? It is the market leader. Between the UK and Scandinavia, they're probably the most mature markets, closely followed by, or competitively followed by, if you will, Singapore and maybe Australia and New Zealand. Really, the UK, in many ways, leads the world in terms of innovation and new types of payment rails that exist. Yeah. Certainly things like the faster payment system, the BACS payment system, etc., that exists in the UK is very much seen as being the benchmark of good payments.
Absolutely. So we talked about the development of the payment space up until now, since you've been involved. What does, getting the crystal ball, what does the future look like? What are you most excited about in terms of innovation in the payment space right now?
I would say, for me, something that will be the most dynamic in terms of changes will be real-time payments, but at a cross-border level. So we run the national payment services, or national real-time payment services, as the engine room, in effect. Yeah. But that stops at the UK border. So the volume of the foreign transaction market is enormous. So some people will see it as the FX market, and that is basically sending currencies around the world. But there's an opportunity there to be able to enable the connection between two countries' real-time payment systems. Yeah, I'll talk about an example of that in a minute. But the other one that's really interesting and that I think will be quite incredibly changing in terms of the future state for some of the frontier and emerging markets in the world, and that is the home send remittance market. So a home send remittance is where someone who is considered to be a foreign worker, who is working in country A but is from country B, sends their earnings home.
This is a big issue in Latin America, isn't it? I know El Salvador legalized Bitcoin 100, but mainly because of this problem, didn't they?
And there's some of the world's largest populations have a huge diaspora of foreign-based workers who send home incredible volumes of cash back to their countries.
Yeah.
And they use that money to pay for, domestic needs. So,
sure, yeah. It's a massive part of GDP,
kids' school fees or, prescriptions or rent or what have you. And it is a huge part of the GDP. And at the moment, the way that they have to send that money home, their options are pretty limited and they're expensive. Right? So the average is, I think, about 11% in fees for that money to be sent home. And so if you're a low earner working in a foreign currency, you're sending all of your money back to your home territory. Taking 11% bite out of that is significant. Yeah. So where I think the big transformational change will come is when there is real-time cross-border payments enabled, because those populations that are working foreign-based will be able to send money in real time, and those fees would be radically different, as in incredibly reduced. Now that increases the payment flow volumes, likely, would be my suggestion, and then changes the nature of the way that recipient country can forecast and predict the volumes that are coming into that country.
Right.
And that has a huge change for many of those foreign countries, because it is a significant flow of their GDP. And if you reduce the friction, as we describe it as, by creating the real-time payments concept, you reduce the fees, you then are likely to see greater volumes coming into that country, which is beneficial for all those people in that recipient country. So you think about the way that, you go out for dinner with a friend and you decide you're going to split the bill later. And so you move money between...
the eternal problem,
right? You move money between two people and you enter their account details and you flick them half the bill. And you expect that money to arrive within a very short period of time. So that's assumed now, and that becomes an expected service that exists in the UK. Many countries overseas, that's impossible. You have to write them a check.
Yeah.
That's the good old-fashioned way that we used to know and love of, 5 to 7 days later, perhaps. That money then lands in your friend's account, and you've got to watch your account because at some point that money's going to get drawn down, and so on. So, the part that's interesting for me is, firstly, on a sort of an international scale, domestic real-time payment services is really only available in a small number of countries.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And so once you start to get more countries enabled onto a real-time payments or an ACH payments vehicle, that then sets up quite interesting conversations for cross-border real-time payments. And so we're building at the moment a service, we're helping to build a service called P27. And P27 is a future state of where 3 of the Scandinavian countries will be able to conduct real-time cross-border payments in multi-currency capability. So Sweden, Denmark and Finland are participating in this. Potentially future state will be Norway as well. And they'll be able to move money between those 3 countries, whether they're at a point of sale in one country or transferring money to a friend over the border. It'll happen at the same speed as you sending money to your mate down the road for sharing dinner last night.
Wow.
Yeah, so this will be the first time it's ever been done.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Wow, that's really exciting. So you guys have created a risk and payments framework for organizations to have like a global standard. Tell us about how that came about and what you're doing to create this global standard.
Okay, so we're selling national payment system enablement to nation states all around the world. And we run payment systems and provide payment software into countries like Thailand and the Philippines, Peru, Denmark, like I mentioned, UK, etc. So we're really diverse in our markets. And they all have different levels of regulation and what have you. And so the concept we put forward was, let's write a rule book for payments using the experience of the mature markets that have real-time payments, such as the UK, and taking all the parts that we know to be international best practice standards and methodologies and collect that into a single library. So we did that.
Sure.
And so we've got this library of artifacts of over, I think, 500 artifacts now. And so we now offer a service to our customers around the world where we'll go and sit down with them and from that library down select key rules and benchmarks and standards that then can become that country's rule book for payments. And that then gives them a foundation to be able to create a platform of good governance.
Yeah.
Because the ultimate goal is to protect the consumer, right? So the citizen who's using the payment system, in the same way you expect here today your faster payment service to work instantaneously, so too should every other country that then wants to stand up that real-time payment service. And so the question sits, how do you manage that? And so what is the mechanism to ensure that it's run appropriately? And how fast should the transaction move? And what is its resilience and its failover, et cetera? All these sort of questions we then collate into that rule book for payments. We've gone ahead and done that. And next week I'm in Africa speaking to the African central banks at a conference in Tanzania where we're presenting exactly that piece of work. And the idea behind it is to work with those countries to give them a set of standards that sets them up to be able to be measurable against peer countries' standards.
Yeah.
And then you start getting into that quite exciting conversation to say, well, if one particular country is running a set of standards that are recognised by all the financial institutions that participate in that payment scheme domestically, and their neighbour has the same or similar types of benchmarks and standards, then it's quite easy to conceptualise a cross-border rulebook that then links those two countries together and allowing their central banks or their regulators to create a common criteria approach to real-time payments. And so when you look at that from a financial inclusion point of view, you start to be able to bring folks who are unbanked, is the phrase, or underbanked.
Which is still a large part of the global population,
part of the
isn't
population. Huge part of the population. You start to offer those folks who have, who are often very connected on a cellular phone network system, but it may be completely unbanked, domestically speaking. So they sit in this grey economy. And so what that does is that makes it difficult for the government to be able to predict things like true treasury values of transactions and what have you. If you enable that smartphone to be able to sit in a real-time payments rail without the need necessarily to have a bank account, you then start to be able to offer the ability for that particular part of the community to start receiving larger volumes of inflow or more frequent inflows of cash because you've got a rule book that gives everyone a clear and transparent set of standards with which the service has to be run against.
We talked a little bit up there about the unbanked. There's an enormous amount of people in the world who are unbanked, but there's a smaller number of people who don't have mobile phones. You know what I mean? So digital technology is in the hands of way more people than those who have bank accounts. And therefore, my favorite case study of this is it was in Kenya, which I think we did touch upon before, which is people using mobile phone credit instead of the local currency.
That's right.
Because it was just more convenient. It's called the M-Pesa, I think, isn't it?
M-Pesa was one of the first, if you will, real-time payment services in the world. So the Kenyans were leading the way. And they came up, they've now matured that a lot, much further along.
So just to clarify for the listeners now, people were using mobile phone credit as a medium of exchange for goods and services, weren't they?
Almost like
astonishing.
It was like a world-leading digital asset.
And intended, though, it was crazy. So
that's right. And it's amazing how humans will find a way, right, through these sort of, rather than good old hard cash. They found it more convenient to transfer digital credits to each other.
And this was going on 10 years ago, wasn't it? In Kenya, maybe even longer. It's not like the last couple of years. It's a while back.
And they were doing this similar in Malaysia and in other parts of the world.
Really?
And so, you can see where this becomes hugely viable in that if you're standing there, and you're wanting to buy and sell goods and services and you have got the money on one device and you've got a recipient on an equivalent device on the same network, and you want to be able to trust that you can send, your transaction of 100, whatever it is, to that particular person, you want to have that trusted network because then everyone will use it.
Of course.
But then it's got to be resilient. It's got to be always up.
Yes.
So then you get this expectation because it becomes ubiquitous in its use. So therefore you need to have a set of rules to make sure that all the participants are given fair and equal chance to run and participate in that service. And so that's what we propose to write, is exactly that, a rule book for payments.
So I wanted to ask you about the pandemic situation, Tim. We've just come out of an unprecedented period and much has changed in the last 3 years, I think it's fair to say. What has Mastercard taken from the pandemic situation that you guys are going to potentially take forward?
Well, like a lot of sort of office-based working, that's now radically shifted for us. Of course, we're working from home through all that period. And I think where we've settled now is into the hybrid working from home office model. So most of our people are in 2 to 3 days a week is kind of the typical. But what it's also done, I think, is opened up opportunities for people to work in lots of places that they haven't been able to before, both internationally and regionally. And, I know people internally that have taken the opportunity of COVID to move to places where they think, they find a bit of lifestyle. And I certainly don't miss coming into the office 5 days a week.
No.
So that change, of course, in sort of, I suppose, office culture as a result. One thing we did notice on some of the challenges around that is I certainly find, I think some of the relationships change because you don't see people face to face as frequently.
Yeah.
And so I think that changes for the negative. And also you miss out on some of the friendships that used to be there.
Sure.
So you've always got a couple of work buddies that aren't there as well. So there's positives and negatives. But overall, I think hybrid's here to stay, if I'm honest.
Yeah, sure. I think there's an element of, like, when you remove serendipity, like random conversations in the office. I think I've read a few blogs and things recently saying that there will be a longer term impact of that in terms of creativity. You know what I mean? Because serendipity and unarising situations which cause you to react in the moment when you're working amongst your peers in a face-to-face environment tend to sometimes yield things like positive change,
They do.
And new products and things. Do you think innovation will suffer?
I think it will. I sit on the management committee for one of the businesses in the UK, and we discussed at quite a bit of length the teams that were feeling the most sort of fractured from the COVID effect. And it's often the teams that are in the creative side or in engineering build teams where they're, previously they've been a group of them in a room conceptualizing a product build on a whiteboard is near impossible to do that in a remote sense because you can't interact in that sort of creative way. And also it means that you can't answer, overly complex situations as fast.
Sure.
So you end up sort of breaking down what is a faster moving collaborative conversation into 5 30-minute meetings over Zoom.
Yeah.
It becomes a very different experience.
And just so the listeners are aware, we're sitting in Tim's office and there's probably the biggest whiteboard I've ever seen in my life in front of us. Clearly a fan of whiteboards, and I'm actually, sold on it. It's this is a great way to communicate ideas for sure. But
and probably more acronyms than you've ever seen.
Yeah, indeed there are. So let's talk about more broader technology-based endeavors then. Well, what are you sort of, outside of payments, outside of even fintech, what sort of tech are you most excited about at the moment in terms of positive societal change? I find,
and I participate a lot in trading on, the new easily accessible apps that are out there. I'm not a significant trader in that sense, but I like the accessibility to fintech environments. That's what I think is.
So do you mean like the democratization of information and the ability for anyone to invest in things which were only available to certain people?
Yeah, correct. Previously it was a fairly exclusive club to be a member of. You either had to be, you either operated in a formal institutional trading environment or you had to go through a large professional service offering or what have you. Now it is exactly that. It has been brought down to, the accessibility level is absolutely grassroots. The mum and dad retail investors are very much active now in the markets, and I think that was intensified through the COVID period where people had time at home to be able to perform those sort of trades that previously they've never been able to do. And also the suggestion was that they had more disposable cash because they weren't traveling into their office every day and spending money on spending less money on day-to-day things. And so I think it's probably true that quite a number of people started to trade that have never traded before.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's loads of people who got into it in the last couple of years, isn't there?
And add to that then, of course, the digital asset piece and the various digital currencies that are available also then heightened that. And of course, the market was flying, wasn't it, for quite a while. So that gave rise to a whole lot of, new activity and new people on the markets, which I think has had an effect. It'd be interesting in years to come to see, sociologists analyse where we are now in terms of coming down and how that may or may not have influenced it. But either way, I find it a fascinating change in sort of market interaction in the fintech space. And fintechs collectively speaking. So I don't know if you use it, but certainly I use things like, budget apps that help me understand, where I'm spending my money, and you've got lots of options around, savings capability and access to ISAs and all these sort of things that previously, you had to go and sit down with someone in a branch of a bank somewhere or an investment professional, etc. So that democratization, as you say, I think is offering a whole lot of accessibility. And if it's working well in a mature market like this, to, peg it back to the conversation we were having earlier, some of those frontier and emerging markets, they have the same level of connectivity in terms of mobile devices and digital infrastructure. So I think what that then does is carries itself across into those markets as well. And I think it pushes the whole financial inclusion piece, which is the part that I find quite interesting. So it's something I follow quite closely.
Can you imagine the amount of talent that is out there that did not fulfill their potential because they didn't have access to certain things? I think we're going to see an enormous spike of entrepreneurialism, digital entrepreneurialism from developing nations over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
I agree. And I think necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? And some of those markets have, I would suggest, a far greater need to successfully overcome challenges locally. Sure. And if they have access to funding, they've got access to technology vehicles that previously have never been there before, I think you're right. I think we are going to see some pretty interesting capabilities coming out of some of those environments that previously have been hugely underrepresented.
Brilliant. Well, look, really enjoyed chatting to you, Tim, but I'd like to ask you about what Tim does outside of work. I know you're training for an Ironman at the moment. You're into extreme events, if you want to call them that. What kind of stuff do you get up to outside of work?
Well, my wife has banned me from rugby, so that's it.
Career's over.
I've done my 30 years. The career's done. I now help coach my 10-year-old in his career aspirations for rugby. But
is that rugby union? Yeah,
it is. Yeah. Although I wouldn't mind a bit of league as well. Either one of the two, I'm good with. But so it's now that all contact sports are banned. That's no longer allowed. So a friend of mine got me into doing some short course triathlons, as they're known, which is sort of sprint and the Olympic distance. I did the London Olympic distance at the London Triathlon last year, which was great fun. And so a group of friends convinced me to sign up for the Barcelona Ironman. I'm only doing the half Ironman distance, I've got to say. So I was mentioning before, the plan for me is just to finish. I'm just going to get around the course rather than any time. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
So what do you take from the triathlon training and all that kind of thing then? What's your sort of raison d'etre then, your reason for doing it?
It's I get out of the work headspace, one, because usually I'm suffering, either running a distance or swimming or cycling. And so I'm more worried about myself and the pain I'm going through. But actually, I love the experience of that feeling, certainly in anyone who runs or does any sort of endurance sport will often talk about this, is that feeling you get either once you're in the zone in that activity, once you get to a fit enough stage, but also when you come back. And certainly for me, if I've had a particularly tough day or there's a very complex issue that we're trying to deal with, one of the things I do find is I'll take myself out for a long run, usually with the dog, and sometimes my son as well will chase me on his mountain bike, and I come back an hour later and whatever was bothering me before seems somehow infinitesimally, I really couldn't care anymore. It really does help me sort of psychologically reassess.
Sure.
Things that I previously would have considered a stressor. fall away.
I think when you are doing something, a physical endeavor, it doesn't have to be training, it can be anything similar. It brings you into the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It brings you into the now, because your brain is in the past and the future so often. Just get in the now, And
I think that almost that suffering is cathartic in that you realize things could be a lot worse.
Absolutely.
And so it gives you just, I think, a reference point, and I find it quite grounding. But for me, psychologically, certainly that for me is my huge de-stressor.
So looking back at your career then, you've obviously, you've been very successful up until now, and I'm sure you're going to continue that success. But looking back, what advice would you give to yourself as a 21-year-old who's looking to embark on a career in the world of business and technology and risk?
Do something that you genuinely are passionate about, because I think you naturally will find your way. If you're passionate about anything, then you'll give it enough time, effort, and focus that you'll be pretty good at it. Would be what I would say. And the other thing is, don't forget your pension, because you can never start too early.
Yeah. That's a good advice, actually. I mean, it's kind of the unsexy bit of advice, but I mean, it's not something that anyone ever regrets, is it?
Compounded interest.
Yeah.
So but if you can find something you're passionate about, then brilliant. The golden challenge of trying to find something that you love doesn't feel like a job. And,
sure.
If you can do that, then you're winning, I think.
What kind of piece of content, like a book or a film or documentary or I don't know, an audiobook or podcast, is there anything that's inspired you?
So one of the things I do listen to is podcasts when I run. And I tend to sort of voraciously consume some of the economist podcasts that come out with a big international perspective on what's happening in the world. And also I listen to, there's a really fascinating New York Times podcast. There's a few different podcasts that are produced by a couple of different folks out there, and there's too many to name really, but I have an interest about sort of health and well-being in terms of things like diets and exercise and those things, more so to work out what I'm doing wrong to myself, to get myself across that half Ironman that's coming up. But I do find that fascinating insofar as the link between health and lifestyle and ability to perform. And for me, I sort of link all that together when I can. And it's being a risk officer, one of the things we're constantly trying to scan always is that horizon of issues that, are out there. And so I try to sort of, I suppose, blend my learning in an easy way, if that makes sense, sort of almost a passive intake. So I go for that run for an hour and I might listen to a podcast for 30 minutes of it and come away with, a better understanding of geopolitics of the world, or, changing economic picture, or, analysis of why, sleep patterns affect your ability to work or concentrate or what have you.
Yeah.
For me, it's more about, I suppose, developing my knowledge as a person about what's happening around me is
sure
what I tend to do.
Fantastic. Well, look, Tim, I'm so grateful for you coming on, and thanks for hosting us today.
You're very welcome.
As you quite possibly have heard me mentioning in the past, we record the mass majority of our episodes at an amazing studio facility here in Cardiff at Tramshed Tech. Tramshed Tech is a collaborative community of entrepreneurs and scaling businesses geared towards supporting growth in tech, digital and creative industries across an ever-increasing collection of locations and partner locations, UK-wide and internationally. It really is the perfect place for your business to start up, scale up, accelerate or innovate. Head over to tramshedtech.co.uk or just search Tramshed Tech on your favourite social media platform.